The November fog of 1894 had descended upon London with such persistence that even the gas lamps of Baker Street seemed to struggle against its oppressive embrace. From our sitting-room window, I observed the occasional flicker of light penetrating the gloom, while my friend, Sherlock Holmes, sat in contemplative silence, his angular frame folded into his customary chair. The Morning Post had brought little of interest, and I could sense that familiar restlessness beginning to stir within him, a dangerous state that often preceded his more questionable experiments with chemical compounds. It was at precisely 10:30 that Mrs. Hudson's gentle knock interrupted the morning quiet. "Mr. Holmes," she announced, "Inspector Lestrade wishes to see you urgently. He appears most distressed, sir." Holmes's grey eyes brightened with that keen anticipation I had come to recognize as the harbinger of adventure. "Show him up immediately, Mrs. Hudson. The day may yet prove stimulating." Lestrade entered our rooms with uncharacteristic hesitation, his usually confident demeanor replaced by an expression of profound bewilderment. His bowler hat trembled slightly in his grasp, and despite the morning chill, a fine sheen of perspiration dotted his brow. "Holmes," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I confess myself utterly defeated. If this case doesn't require your particular talents, then I fear we're dealing with forces beyond natural law." Holmes leaned forward with interest, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "Indeed, Lestrade. Such an admission from Scotland Yard's most tenacious inspector suggests a mystery of exceptional complexity. Pray, enlighten us." "It concerns the Whitmore Gallery in Bloomsbury," Lestrade continued, settling heavily into the chair opposite Holmes. "Sir Edmund Whitmore commissioned a portrait of his late wife from the artist Cornelius Blackwood, a remarkable piece titled Lady Margaret in Blue. The painting was completed just before Blackwood's sudden death 3 months ago." "And what makes this portrait so troublesome?" I inquired, my notebook already open. Lestrade's expression grew even more perplexed. "The confounded thing won't stay damaged, Doctor. 3 separate attempts have been made to vandalize it, slashed with knives, scorched with acid, even set ablaze. Yet each morning, the gallery staff discover it hanging pristine and untouched, as if no harm had ever befallen it." Holmes's eyebrows rose slightly. "Most intriguing. And the security arrangements?" "Impeccable," Lestrade replied emphatically. "And the gallery is locked with 3 separate mechanisms. The windows are barred, and a night watchman patrols the premises hourly. Yet yesterday morning, we found something that defies all explanation." He paused, as if gathering courage for what followed. "The watchman, Thomas Grimsby, a reliable man of 20 years' service, was discovered unconscious in the portrait gallery. When he revived, he claimed to have witnessed the painting restore itself before his very eyes, watching as burn marks faded and slash marks sealed themselves like healing wounds." "Fascinating," Holmes murmured, his fingers drumming against the chair arm. "And Grimsby's condition?" "The physician found traces of chloral hydrate in his system, though no bottle or vial was discovered. More puzzling still, we found several curious items scattered about the gallery floor. Fragments of unusual pigment that seemed to glow with their own light, a small vial containing an oily substance with a peculiar lavender scent, and this." Lestrade produced a crumpled piece of paper from his waistcoat. It was pinned to the portrait's frame with a common tack. The message reads simply, "She will not fade." Holmes examined the note with his magnifying glass, his expression growing increasingly animated. The handwriting suggests someone accustomed to using a steel nib, attempting to write with a pencil. "Note the uneven pressure and the characteristic downstrokes. Most illuminating." "Sir Edmund is beside himself," Lestrade continued. "He insists the portrait is cursed, that his wife's spirit refuses to let her image be destroyed. The press has caught wind of the story, and the gallery is besieged by curiosity seekers and spiritualists. We need answers, Holmes, before this madness spreads further." Holmes rose from his chair with sudden energy, his eyes now blazing with intellectual hunger. "Watson, fetch your coat and medical bag. Lestrade, we shall accompany you to the Whitmore Gallery immediately. This case promises to test the very boundaries between the possible and the impossible." As I gathered my things, I caught sight of Holmes's reflection in the window glass, and I recognized that expression of intense concentration that invariably preceded his most brilliant deductions. The game, as he would say, was afoot, and this particular game appeared to challenge the very laws of nature themselves. The hansom cab lurched through the fog-shrouded streets toward Bloomsbury, its wheels finding every cobblestone with jarring precision. The November mist had thickened considerably since our departure from Baker Street, transforming London into a ghostly labyrinth where gas lamps flickered like dying stars. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his keen eyes studying Lestrade with that peculiar intensity I had come to recognize as the prelude to one of his remarkable deductions. "Tell me, Lestrade," Holmes said suddenly, his voice cutting through the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves. "Your morning began rather earlier than usual, did it not? I observe you breakfasted hastily at the Charing Cross refreshment room. Their distinctive German mustard has left its mark upon your cuff, and you visited Fleet Street before calling upon us." Lestrade started, his eyes widening in that familiar expression of bewildered admiration. "Good heavens, Holmes! How could you?" "Possibly, yes, precisely correct. The Yard's press office insisted we prepare a statement for the newspapers. But how did you know?" "Elementary observation, my dear fellow. The paper ash upon your knee is from a proof sheet, not common newsprint, and your right boot bears traces of the particular mud found only in Fleet Street's gutters after a morning shower." Holmes's smile was barely perceptible. "A regrettable decision, I fear. The press attention will complicate our investigation considerably." "You mentioned this artist, Cornelius Blackwood," I interjected, consulting my notebook. "What manner of man was he?" Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. "A peculiar fellow, by all accounts. Lived as a recluse in Whitechapel, devoted entirely to his work. Found dead in his studio 3 months ago, massive cerebral hemorrhage, according to the coroner. No foul play suspected, though he was only 42. "And his artistic methods?" Holmes pressed, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Most unusual," Lestrade replied, warming to his subject. "Sir Edmund specifically sought him out for his reputation in achieving extraordinary realism. Blackwood was known to experiment with rare pigments, some containing minerals our forensic chemist couldn't even identify. He'd researched ancient Egyptian preservation techniques, apparently attempting to create paintings that would resist the ravages of time." Holmes's eyebrows rose slightly. How remarkably prescient. "And these experimental materials were any found in his studio after his death?" "The studio was cleared by his landlord shortly after the funeral. Sir Edmund acquired the portrait and several sketches, but Blackwood's notes and remaining materials were disposed of." Lestrade's expression grew troubled, though our chemist did examine those glowing fragments found at the gallery. He described them as containing rare earth elements with phosphorescent properties, mixed with an organic compound of unusual complexity. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured. "A man obsessed with permanence, working with materials that glow with their own light. The symbolism is hardly subtle." Our cab drew to a halt before the imposing Georgian facade of the Whitmore Gallery. Despite the early hour and oppressive fog, a considerable crowd had gathered on the pavement, curious gentlemen in silk hats mingling with working-class women and their children, all drawn by the sensational reports of the supernatural portrait. "The vultures have arrived," Lestrade muttered as we alighted. Holmes surveyed the crowd with calculating eyes. "Indeed. Note the gentleman in the brown ulster coat taking notes, either a journalist or someone with more personal interest in our mysterious Lady Margaret." The gallery's classical columns rose from the mist like ancient sentinels, their stone surfaces beaded with moisture. As we approached the entrance, where a constable stood guard, I caught sight of a distinguished gentleman with a carefully maintained white mustache hurrying toward us, his face etched with worry and exhaustion. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, Inspector Lestrade," he called, extending his hand with evident relief. "I am Sir Edmund Whitmore. Thank God you've come. This nightmare grows worse by the hour." Holmes inclined his head courteously. "Sir Edmund, you have our complete attention. Before we examine the portrait, however, I should like to know who possesses keys to your gallery." "3 sets exist," Sir Edmund replied promptly. "I hold one, our curator, Miss Agatha Vale, another, and our porter, Mr. Pierce, keeps the third. The building is secured with multiple locks, and the windows are barred throughout." "And Miss Vale, she has worked with you long?" "5 years. An exemplary curator with an encyclopedic knowledge of artistic techniques." Sir Edmund's voice carried a note of defensive pride. "She was particularly devoted to cataloguing Blackwood's work after his death." Holmes nodded, thoughtfully, his gaze already moving toward the gallery's interior, where gaslight flickered warmly against polished marble floors. "Then let us meet this remarkable portrait that refuses to fade, and perhaps discover why someone is so determined that Lady Margaret should achieve the immortality her creator so desperately sought." The interior of the Whitmore Gallery embraced us with hushed reverence, though an underlying tension seemed to permeate the very air. Our footsteps echoed against polished marble as Sir Edmund led us through corridors lined with masterpieces, each illuminated by carefully positioned gas fixtures that cast dancing shadows upon the walls. Despite the fog pressing against the tall windows, sufficient natural light filtered through to reveal the gallery's impressive collection, yet my attention was inevitably drawn toward our destination. "The portrait hangs in our main exhibition hall," Sir Edmund explained, his voice subdued as we approached a pair of ornate double doors. "I must warn you, gentlemen, that even in daylight, the painting possesses an unsettling quality that has disturbed more than one visitor." Holmes paused at the threshold, his acute senses already cataloguing details invisible to ordinary observation. "The flooring here shows considerable recent traffic," he noted, examining scuff marks on the marble. "These heel impressions suggest someone has paced this corridor repeatedly, someone wearing expensive leather boots with a distinctive wear pattern." We entered the exhibition hall, a magnificent chamber with soaring ceilings where Lady Margaret Whitmore commanded the far wall with almost magnetic presence. The portrait depicted a woman of perhaps 30 years, her auburn hair arranged in elaborate coiffure, wearing an exquisite sapphire gown that seemed to shimmer with inner light. Yet it was her expression that proved most remarkable, eyes of such startling blue intensity that I felt momentarily disoriented, combined with a subtle smile suggesting secrets known only to her. "Extraordinary craftsmanship," I breathed, unable to suppress my admiration. Holmes approached with characteristic methodical precision, his magnifying glass emerging from his waistcoat pocket. Rather than rushing to the canvas, however, he began a systematic circuit of the room, examining the polished floors, ornate cornices, and subtle variations in gaslight illumination. His movements were deliberate, occasionally stooping to study minute imperfections or faint marks invisible to the casual observer. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, kneeling before the portrait. "This semicircular pattern on the floorboards extends roughly 2 feet from the easel. Note the subtle crystalline residue, visible only when light catches it precisely so." He drew his finger across the surface, revealing a faint, almost imperceptible sheen. Not merely polish, but something discharged repeatedly. Rising, Holmes finally turned his attention to the painting itself. His examination was exhaustive, tracing every inch of canvas with scientific precision. He scrutinized the texture of paint, the minute craquelure of aging, and the way light played upon the surface. Particular attention was paid to the edges where canvas met frame, and then to the ornate gilded frame itself. "This frame is considerably newer than the painting," Holmes observed. "When was it reframed, Sir Edmund?" "Just last month," Sir Edmund replied, looking puzzled. "The original was damaged during transport from Blackwood's studio." Miss Vale supervised the replacement selection. Holmes nodded, moving to examine the wall behind the portrait. Running his gloved fingers along the plaster, he paused, head cocked as if listening, then tapped lightly. Yet something had caught his attention near the floor level. "Lestrade," he said suddenly, "observe these marks on the wallpaper. The pattern suggests this portrait has been removed and rehung multiple times, far more frequently than normal maintenance would require. We relocated it twice after the vandalism attempts," Sir Edmund admitted reluctantly, each time hoping a different position might discourage further attacks. "Yet the vandal found it regardless," Holmes mused, stepping back to survey the entire arrangement, his grey eyes fixed upon a point just above Lady Margaret's head with sharp intensity. "The pigments used here are indeed unusual. Note how certain areas possess an almost opalescent quality, particularly around the eyes and hands." A sudden sound from the corridor drew our attention, measured footsteps approaching with evident purpose. Sir Edmund glanced toward the entrance with visible relief. "That will be Miss Vale," he announced. "Her punctuality is legendary, and her knowledge of Blackwood's methods unparalleled. She compiled detailed documentation of every incident involving this portrait." Holmes straightened, his expression sharpening with anticipation. "In the distance, I caught the faint scent of lavender mixed with something more elusive, beeswax, perhaps, or linseed oil. The approaching footsteps grew more distinct, accompanied by the soft rustle of skirts against marble. Then perhaps," Holmes said quietly, his gaze returning to Lady Margaret's enigmatic smile, "we shall finally begin to understand how this remarkable woman achieves her supernatural resilience and why someone is so determined that she should never fade." The mystery deepened with each passing moment, yet I sensed that Holmes had already begun to perceive the underlying pattern that would eventually reveal the truth behind this most perplexing case. Miss Agatha Vale entered the exhibition hall with the measured precision of someone accustomed to navigating galleries in contemplative silence. She was a woman of perhaps 38 years, possessed of a severe yet striking beauty. Her dark auburn hair arranged in a practical chignon that spoke of efficiency rather than vanity. Her attire, a well-tailored dress of charcoal grey wool, emphasized her professional bearing, while her intelligent grey eyes held an unmistakable wariness as they swept over our assembled group before settling upon the portrait with obvious familiarity. "Sir Edmund," she acknowledged, her voice carrying the cultured tones of educated refinement, "I trust these gentlemen are here to resolve our unfortunate situation." A faint scent of lavender accompanied her presence, mingled with the waxy tang of linseed oil and something sharper that I could not immediately identify. "Miss Vale, allow me to present Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson," Sir Edmund replied with evident relief. "They have graciously agreed to investigate these most disturbing incidents." Holmes stepped forward with characteristic courtesy, though I observed his keen eyes cataloguing every detail of her appearance and manner. "Miss Vale, your reputation as a scholar of artistic technique precedes you. I understand you were instrumental in cataloguing Mr. Blackwood's revolutionary methods?" "Indeed," she replied, moving toward the portrait with practiced familiarity. "Cornelius was obsessed with permanence in an age of transient beauty. His techniques incorporated elements from medieval illumination, Renaissance masters, and even ancient Egyptian preservation methods. He developed his own formulations using rare earth minerals, crushed pearls, and organic compounds of his own devising." Holmes had begun his methodical examination of the immediate vicinity, his magnifying glass emerging as he studied the floor patterns with scientific precision. "These crystalline residues," he murmured, indicating the semicircular pattern before the easel. "They correspond to the fragments found after the incidents?" "Precisely," Miss Vale confirmed, her scholarly enthusiasm overriding her initial reserve. The phosphorescent elements were integral to Cornelius's experimental pigments. He believed conventional paints were inherently fragile, destined to fade and crack within decades. Yet surely such experimental methods required assistance, Holmes inquired, straightening to observe both Miss Vale and the painting simultaneously. Complex formulations, precise applications, hardly the work of a single individual. A subtle change came over Miss Vale's demeanor, a barely perceptible tightening around her eyes. Cornelius was secretive about his final techniques. However, he did employ an assistant, a young man named Elias Thorne. Thorne was intensely devoted to Cornelius, almost fanatically so. "Ah," Holmes said softly, his interest sharpening. "And where might we find Mr. Thorne?" "He vanished from London shortly after the funeral," Miss Vale replied, her voice growing troubled. "He was distraught, convinced that Cornelius's death resulted from overwork and neglect by the art world. Thorne saw him as a misunderstood genius and was prone to grand, romantic gestures." Lestrade's expression brightened with the satisfaction of a man seeing his case simplify. A devoted assistant, believing his master wronged, disappearing after the death, it fits perfectly. He clearly believes Lady Margaret's image should remain inviolable. Before Holmes could respond, a commotion arose from the corridor. A constable appeared, escorting a gentleman in a brown ulster coat whom I recognized from the crowd outside. The man waved a press card with obvious authority. "Lionel Dacre, Evening Herald," he announced. "Inspector, you'll want to see this. I received an anonymous letter 2 days before the first attack." He produced a folded sheet with theatrical flourish. It reads, "She will not fade. Attend the Whitmore Gallery and witness the triumph of art over time. When fire passes, truth remains." Holmes accepted the letter with grave interest, examining it through his magnifying glass. The handwriting suggests someone accustomed to using a steel nib attempting to write with a pencil, he observed. "Most illuminating." Miss Vale had grown noticeably pale during this exchange, her hands clasped tightly before her. "If you suggest manufactured publicity, Mr. Dacre, you malign our institution's integrity." "Nevertheless," Lestrade said with growing confidence, "the evidence points towards someone with intimate knowledge of Blackwood's methods. Miss Vale, your expertise, your access, your familiarity with the unusual materials." "Inspector," Holmes interrupted quietly, his grey eyes fixed upon Lady Margaret's luminous countenance. "Premature conclusions often obscure deeper truths. The line between trick and miracle may be thin, but it leaves very solid footprints indeed." He moved closer to examine a particular section of the canvas, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "We shall require the watchman's testimony before proceeding further. Meanwhile, I suggest no one disturb this remarkable lady until we understand precisely how she achieves her supernatural resilience." Sir Edmund led us to a modest withdrawing room adjacent to the main hall, where Thomas Grimsby sat with obvious discomfort, his weathered hands twisting his cap with nervous energy. The night watchman bore the unmistakable marks of his ordeal, bloodshot eyes that spoke of recent trauma, and a slight tremor that suggested the chloral hydrate had not entirely departed his system. Despite his distress, however, his countenance held the steady resolve of a man determined to speak truthfully, regardless of how extraordinary his account might sound. "Mr. Grimsby," Holmes began, settling into his chair with characteristic precision, "I require only facts in their exact sequence. Begin with your rounds on the night in question, omitting nothing, however insignificant it might seem." "I was making my midnight circuit, sir," Grimsby replied, his voice hoarse but determined. "All appeared normal when I first passed Lady Margaret's hall. The gaslight was trimmed to half value, as is my custom to preserve the jets. At precisely 1 o'clock, I heard a peculiar sound like steam escaping, or perhaps labored breathing emanating from the portrait gallery." Holmes leaned forward with keen interest. "You investigated immediately?" "Aye, sir." As I approached, a strange scent filled the corridor, lavender, sharp and medicinal, mixed with something metallic that burned my throat. When I entered the hall, the very air seemed different, charged somehow, and there was an ethereal glow surrounding Lady Margaret's gown. Holmes instructed, his grey eyes fixed intently upon the watchman's face. Grimsby's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The portrait was damaged. Sir, 3 diagonal slashes across the canvas, burn marks where acid had been applied. It was ruined, utterly destroyed. Yet as I watched in horror, the tears began to seal themselves, like wounds healing before my very eyes. The burn marks faded. The colors grew vibrant again, and Lady Margaret's smile seemed to become more pronounced. "You were alone during this phenomenon?" Holmes inquired, though his tone suggested he suspected otherwise. "No, sir. There was someone else present, a figure in dark clothing moving near the portrait with practiced familiarity. They carried a small case containing bottles and brushes, working with swift, precise movements. When they noticed my presence, they seemed startled, dropping something that shattered against the marble floor." Holmes made rapid notes. "Could you identify this person's features or voice?" The shadows were too deep, and my vision was growing hazy. The drowsiness was beginning to affect me then, but I heard a voice, cultured and educated, speaking in urgent whispers. The words were unclear, but the tone suggested desperate urgency, as if time were of critical importance. While Grimsby recounted his extraordinary experience, Holmes had been conducting his own silent examination of the room. His magnifying glass emerged as he studied not merely the obvious evidence, but subtle details others had overlooked, the precise pattern of dust motes in the gaslight, minute scratches on the marble floor, and most intriguingly, a barely perceptible groove running parallel to the wall, partially concealed beneath the edge of an ornate rug. "The patrol ledger, if you please," Holmes requested suddenly. Sir Edmund produced the leather-bound book, its pages filled with neat pencil entries. Holmes examined the final entries with particular attention, his eyebrows rising almost imperceptibly. "This entry, at 1:15 your handwriting, Mr. Grimsby?" The watchman frowned, studying the page. "No, sir. I don't recall making that notation." "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, closing the book with deliberate care. He rose and moved toward the door. "Before we conclude, I should like to speak with your porter, Mr. Pierce." We found Pierce in his lodge, a thin, dignified man of middle years who maintained his post with obvious pride. His quarters were immaculate, containing the usual ledgers, key rack, and a spirit lamp supporting a gently hissing kettle. "You provided tea to Mr. Grimsby at midnight?" Holmes inquired without preamble. "As I do most nights, sir. Strong, with sugar, as he prefers it. I keep the lodge well stocked for the staff's comfort." Holmes's attention had shifted to the key rack, where 3 sets hung in orderly arrangement. "Your keys show traces of a resinous substance," he observed, raising one ring to examine it closely. "Lavender spike oil, mixed with dammer resin." "Cleaning the mechanisms, sir," Pierce replied without hesitation. "We've had trouble with grit. Miss Vale provided the solvent from her restoration supplies. Proper maintenance, nothing more." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his gaze returning to the patrol ledger upon Pierce's desk. "You record Mr. Grimsby's reports as he passes?" "Indeed, sir. He calls the time, and I enter it. Saves him carrying the book during his rounds." As we prepared to depart, Holmes paused at the threshold, his expression holding that peculiar intensity I had learned to recognize as the harbinger of significant deduction. "I shall require the gallery left undisturbed this evening," he announced. "No cleaning, no adjustments to the lighting. Place a constable at the entrance, but allow no one within." "You intend to maintain surveillance?" Lestrade inquired hopefully. "I intend to listen," Holmes replied enigmatically, his gaze returning once more to the portrait hall. There are voices in this mystery that speak very softly indeed, and I fear we have only begun to hear their whispered secrets. The November evening had settled over London with particular density by the time we returned to Baker Street, the fog transforming familiar thoroughfares into an ethereal maze, where gaslight struggled against the oppressive gloom. Holmes maintained his characteristic silence during our journey, though I observed the subtle signs of intense mental activity, the slight tension in his jaw, the rhythmic drumming of his fingers against his knee, and that distant expression which indicated his remarkable mind was processing the day's observations with methodical precision. Upon reaching our lodgings, Holmes immediately retreated to his chemical corner, where he subjected the crystalline fragments provided by Lestrade to exhaustive analysis. Each specimen was examined under varying degrees of magnification, tested with different reagents, and subjected to heat applications that filled our sitting room with peculiar aromatic vapors. He announced suddenly, his voice carrying an undertone of scientific excitement. Observe these phosphorescent particles under the microscope. Note their hexagonal crystalline structure and the way they seem to pulse with rhythmic regularity when exposed to warmth. I peered through the eyepiece, marveling at the geometric precision of the microscopic formations. The particles appeared almost organic in their behavior, responding to temperature variations with subtle changes in luminosity. Most remarkable, I observed, they seemed to possess properties that bridge the mineral and organic kingdoms. Precisely, Watson. These are not merely rare earth compounds, but substances that have been deliberately treated with organic carriers. The lavender spike oil serves not as a simple cleaning agent, but as a sophisticated delivery medium for these extraordinary particles. Holmes made rapid notations in his chemical journal, his excitement barely contained. Professor Hartwell's research confirms that such combinations can create controlled release systems, responding to specific atmospheric conditions with remarkable precision. As the evening progressed, Holmes's restlessness became increasingly apparent. He consumed several cups of strong coffee while pacing our sitting room with the energy of a caged predator, occasionally pausing to examine evidence fragments under different lighting conditions or to consult his extensive library of chemical references. The pattern emerges with greater clarity, he declared, his grey eyes blazing with intellectual fire. We are witnessing not supernatural phenomena, but something far more ingenious, a carefully orchestrated deception that exploits both advanced chemistry and human psychology. Mrs. Hudson's dinner went largely untouched as Holmes continued his analysis. He subjected the mysterious note to various tests, examining the paper composition, ink characteristics, and subtle impressions left by the writing implement. His magnifying glass revealed minute details invisible to ordinary observation, fiber patterns in the paper, microscopic traces of foreign substances, and pressure variations in the handwriting that spoke volumes to his trained eye. Consider the evidence systematically, Watson, Holmes continued, arranging his findings with characteristic precision. Someone possesses intimate knowledge of Blackwood's experimental techniques, unrestricted access to the gallery during crucial moments, and the technical expertise to execute these restorations with extraordinary skill. The question that demands resolution is not how the miracle occurs, but who benefits from maintaining Lady Margaret's pristine appearance. At precisely 9 o'clock, Holmes donned his heaviest overcoat and selected his most reliable dark lantern from our equipment cabinet. His movements carried that purposeful determination I had learned to associate with his most dangerous investigations. "Where do you propose to go?" I inquired, though his preparations suggested a definite nocturnal destination. "To conduct a listening experiment," he replied, checking his pocket watch with characteristic precision. "Atmospheric conditions will be optimal between 11 and midnight. If my deductions prove correct, we shall observe the mechanism behind Lady Margaret's supernatural resilience without disturbing its operation." "Surely you don't intend to proceed alone?" "On the contrary, Watson, Your medical expertise may prove invaluable, particularly if we encounter chloral hydrate or other chemical agents in concentrated form. Bring your bag and wear your warmest clothing. We may be maintaining covert surveillance for several hours. As we prepared for departure, Holmes paused at our threshold, his expression holding that mixture of anticipation and caution I had learned to recognize as the harbinger of significant revelations. Tonight we shall discover whether Lady Margaret's immortality stems from artistic genius or criminal ingenuity, he declared, his voice carrying both confidence and warning. The truth, I suspect, will prove far more remarkable than the supernatural explanations, currently captivating London's imagination. The fog embraced us as we stepped into the night, its chill tendrils seeming to whisper secrets of their own. Yet, despite the oppressive atmosphere, I felt that familiar thrill of adventure that accompanied Holmes's most challenging cases. Whatever mechanisms operated within the Whitmore Gallery's shadowed halls, we would uncover them before dawn illuminated the great city's mysteries. Holmes's confident stride through the murky streets suggested he had begun to perceive the solution's outline, though the final revelation remained tantalizingly beyond my own comprehension. The November fog had thickened to an almost impenetrable wall by the time we approached the Whitmore Gallery, transforming the familiar Georgian facade into a ghostly apparition that seemed to materialize and dissolve with each shift of the oppressive mist. Holmes navigated the treacherous streets with that uncanny ability he possessed to move through London's most challenging conditions, leading us through a circuitous route via the service mews that would allow covert observation without alerting Lestrade's posted constable. "The rear courtyard provides optimal positioning," Holmes whispered, indicating a shadowed alcove between two townhouses where we could observe both the main entrance and service areas. "From here we shall witness Lady Margaret's nocturnal resurrection without disturbing the performance." Holmes had come prepared with his most sophisticated surveillance equipment, a powerful dark lantern with adjustable beam, his field glasses, and most intriguingly, my medical stethoscope, which he handled with the reverence of a scientist approaching a delicate experiment. We settled into our concealed position with the patience that extended observation demanded, the fog providing excellent concealment while muffling sound in ways that made every distant footstep seem both amplified and directionless. At precisely 10:30, our vigil was rewarded. Miss Vale emerged from the gallery's rear entrance, carrying a small leather case and moving with the purposeful efficiency of someone executing a well-rehearsed routine. She paused briefly to ensure the door was properly secured, then vanished into the fog with practiced familiarity, her footsteps fading into the night's oppressive silence. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, his field glasses trained on the now empty doorway. Note that she departed through the service entrance rather than the main gallery doors, suggesting intimate familiarity with alternative access routes and, perhaps, activities requiring discretion. As midnight approached, Holmes suddenly tensed, his attention focused on something I had not detected. "Listen carefully, Watson," he whispered. "Do you hear that rhythmic sound, like precision machinery operating at very low speed?" Straining my ears, I caught the faintest suggestion of mechanical activity emanating from within the gallery. The sound was barely perceptible, a soft whirring punctuated by occasional clicks, as if some complex clockwork mechanism were operating with metronomic precision. "There," Holmes breathed, his field glasses fixed on the portrait gallery windows. "Observe the subtle change in the gaslight's intensity. It fluctuates in perfect rhythm with that mechanical sound. We are witnessing the actual mechanism by which Lady Margaret maintains her pristine appearance." At 5 minutes past midnight, Miss Vale reappeared, but this time she entered through the service door with obvious urgency. Within moments, a faint luminescence began to emanate from the portrait gallery's windows, not the steady glow of gaslight, but something more ethereal and variable, reminiscent of the phosphorescent crystalline fragments Holmes had analyzed earlier. "The restoration cycle has commenced," Holmes concluded with quiet satisfaction. Approximately 12 minutes of active operation, if my calculations prove correct. Holmes produced a small vial of fine ash from his pocket, which he had prepared earlier from our fireplace. "We must witness this process directly, Watson. Follow me." And maintain absolute silence. Using Sir Edmund's key, Holmes gained us entry through a side door, moving through the darkened corridors with the stealth of a seasoned tracker. Upon reaching the main exhibition hall, he scattered the ash in 2 precise crescents, one before the portrait, another near the service entrance, creating an invisible record of any movement. "Now, Watson, your stethoscope," he whispered, pressing the instrument to Lady Margaret's ornate frame in 3 separate locations. His eyes narrowed with concentration. "There is a heartbeat to this frame. Listen." I took the earpieces and obeyed. At first I perceived nothing but the faint settling of timbre. Then, distinct as mechanical breathing, a periodic wheeze and soft tick, the exhalation of air through a narrow aperture, followed by measured mechanical impulses. "A bellows system with clockwork governor," Holmes murmured, reclaiming the instrument. "Our Lady breathes, Watson, under the strictest mechanical supervision." We concealed ourselves behind a pair of Roman busts, and within minutes, Miss Vale appeared in the hall, carrying her leather case and moving with surgical precision toward the portrait. She placed a small spirit lamp on the floor, its flame reflected by a polished copper surface into a bright crescent that bathed Lady Margaret's lower portion in gentle warmth. What followed was extraordinary. The portrait bore fresh, damaged diagonal slashes across the canvas, burn marks where acid had been applied. Miss Vale opened her case, withdrawing a rubber atomizer, small bottles of gleaming substances, and instruments of remarkable precision. As she applied various solutions with a fine brush, the damaged areas began to heal before our eyes, tears sealing themselves, burn marks fading, colors returning to their original vibrancy. Heat to soften the surface film, solvent to mobilize the pigments, and gentle pressure from the internal mechanism. Holmes whispered, "The appearance of miraculous healing is actually a sophisticated chemical ballet." Miss Vale then produced a microscopic atomizer, releasing a fine mist over the entire canvas surface. The air filled with that familiar lavender scent, now much stronger. And as the mist settled, the final traces of damage vanished completely. Holmes rose silently from our concealment, his movements fluid as shadow. "A most remarkable performance, Miss Vale." His voice cut through the stillness with calm authority, though I confess I prefer my art without such elaborate theatrical embellishments. Miss Vale froze, then spun around, her small lantern beam flashing wildly before settling on Holmes's composed figure. The shock and dismay in her rigid posture spoke volumes, though her face remained obscured by shadow. "Mr. Holmes," she said finally, her cultured voice steady despite her obvious distress, "I suppose explanations are in order." "Indeed they are," Holmes replied, stepping into the lamp's illumination. "Beginning with why you have invested such extraordinary effort in maintaining Lady Margaret's supernatural preservation, and what purpose this elaborate deception serves beyond mere artistic conservation." Miss Vale stood motionless in the gaslight's wavering glow, her leather case still clutched in her hands like a shield against the inevitable. The initial shock that had frozen her features gradually gave way to a composed resignation, though I observed the slight tremor in her fingers betraying the magnitude of her distress. She set down her restoration equipment with deliberate care, as if handling sacred relics, and faced Holmes with the dignity of someone who had always known this moment would eventually arrive. "You cannot possibly understand the significance of what you have witnessed," she said quietly, her cultured voice carrying profound conviction rather than guilt. "Cornelius Blackwood was not merely an artist, Mr. Holmes. He was a visionary who discovered methods that could preserve beauty for centuries, perhaps millennia." Holmes approached the portrait with scientific interest, his magnifying glass revealing intricate details within the ornate frame. Indeed, Miss Vale, the internal mechanism you have constructed is remarkably sophisticated. Observe. Watson, microscopic tubes, carrying preservation solutions, pressure-sensitive valves responding to atmospheric changes, and a timing mechanism that activates the restoration cycle at predetermined intervals. The engineering is extraordinary, I admitted, studying the barely visible components Holmes indicated. A clockwork bellows system that maintains optimal humidity levels within the canvas layers. Precisely, Holmes continued, his grey eyes fixed intently upon Miss Vale's face. The phosphorescent particles serve as indicators, glowing when restoration becomes necessary. What we witnessed tonight was not supernatural healing, but the controlled mobilization and repolymerization of specially treated pigments, accelerated by heat from your spirit lamp and the chemical agents you applied. Miss Vale moved toward Lady Margaret with obvious reverence. You observed the damage each morning, the slashes, the acid burns. They were not acts of vandalism at all, were they? I interjected, understanding beginning to dawn. Precisely, Doctor, she replied, her expression softening slightly. I created controlled damage to demonstrate the portrait's self-healing properties. Each attack was carefully executed to showcase a different aspect of Cornelius's genius, the slashing to prove structural integrity, the acid to show chemical resilience, the fire to demonstrate heat resistance. Holmes had been examining the scattered ash he had distributed earlier, confirming the footprint patterns that revealed Miss Vale's solitary involvement in the evening's activities. Your methods were methodical and precise, he observed. The anonymous letters to the press, the carefully timed demonstrations, the supernatural rumors all orchestrated to generate public fascination with Blackwood's revolutionary techniques. Because the art world rejected Cornelius while he lived, Miss Vale replied with passionate intensity. Critics dismissed his innovations as mere technical curiosities. Collectors preferred conventional methods. He died believing his life's work was worthless, his revolutionary techniques destined to be forgotten. So you sought to create posthumous vindication through supernatural spectacle, Holmes concluded, his tone neither accusatory nor approving. The chloral hydrate administered to Mr. Grimsby ensured his incapacitation while lending credence to his fantastical testimony. The altered patrol ledger entry was a simple matter of convenience, ensuring his midnight observation aligned with your performance schedule. Miss Vale's shoulders sagged slightly under the weight of complete exposure. The dosage was carefully calculated to cause no permanent harm. I studied medical texts extensively to ensure his safety. Grimsby's testimony was essential to establishing the supernatural narrative. And your accomplice, Elias Thorne? Holmes pressed. Paris, she replied without hesitation, establishing connections with European collectors who are now eager to acquire Blackwood paintings. Within weeks, collectors from across Europe began inquiring about his other works. Art historians are demanding access to his notebooks. The Royal Academy has expressed interest in commissioning a comprehensive study of his methods. Holmes straightened, his expression growing more serious. A noble goal achieved through questionable means. Yet your elaborate hoax has diverted police resources from legitimate investigations while creating public hysteria based entirely upon fabricated evidence. Criminal charges must be considered, Miss Vale. I accept responsibility for my methods, Mr. Holmes, she replied with quiet dignity. But I cannot regret the results. Cornelius's techniques will now receive the serious scholarly attention they always deserved. As dawn approached, filtering grey light through the fog-shrouded windows, the full magnitude of Miss Vale's elaborate conspiracy became clear. Her devotion to Blackwood's memory had driven her to create one of the most sophisticated artistic hoaxes in recent memory, combining advanced chemistry, precision engineering, and psychological manipulation to achieve posthumous recognition for her mentor's revolutionary techniques. Nevertheless, Holmes said finally. "Justice must take its course. Though I confess admiration for the technical sophistication of your methods, even while deploring the deception they served." The grey dawn light, filtering through the gallery's fog-shrouded windows, cast long, ethereal shadows across the exhibition hall as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridors. Lestrade arrived with 2 uniformed constables, their heavy boots creating a measured cadence against the marble floors. The inspector's face, initially marked by the weariness of a sleepless night, transformed into an expression of profound astonishment as he surveyed the scene before him. Miss Vale, standing with quiet resignation beside her opened case of restoration equipment, while Holmes methodically documented the intricate mechanical apparatus concealed within Lady Margaret's ornate frame. "Good Lord, Holmes," Lestrade breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. "So the supernatural phenomenon was nothing more than an elaborate scientific deception? The vandalism, the miraculous healing, all of it orchestrated?" "Precisely, Inspector," Holmes confirmed, his magnifying glass revealing components barely visible to the naked eye. Every scratch, every burn mark, every supposed act of destruction was a controlled experiment designed to trigger the portrait's restoration process and perpetuate the myth of supernatural preservation. Holmes's examination revealed an engineering marvel that would have impressed the finest clockmakers of Europe. Microscopic tubes distributed preservation solutions throughout the canvas structure. Pressure-sensitive chambers responded to atmospheric variations with mathematical precision, and timing mechanisms activated restoration cycles at predetermined intervals. The complexity was extraordinary, representing a fusion of artistic vision and mechanical genius that transcended conventional conservation methods. Holmes continued, his tone carrying neither condemnation nor admiration. "Your technical expertise extends far beyond conventional art conservation. Where did you acquire such sophisticated knowledge of mechanical engineering and advanced chemistry?" Miss Vale regarded him with weary resignation, though a note of professional pride crept into her cultured voice. "My father was a precision instrument maker for the Royal Observatory, Mr. Holmes. I learned mechanical principles in his workshop before pursuing formal artistic training. When Cornelius recognized my dual expertise, he encouraged me to help develop his revolutionary preservation techniques." Sir Edmund arrived at that moment, his usually composed demeanor replaced by an expression of utter bewilderment. His face cycled through conflicting emotions, betrayal, admiration, confusion, and profound regret as he struggled to comprehend the magnitude of deception that had occurred within his own gallery. "Miss Vale has been our most trusted curator for 5 years, he stammered, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Her dedication to preserving our collection has been exemplary. To learn that she orchestrated this entire elaborate hoax. The partnership between Miss Vale and Blackwood was more extensive than initially indicated," I observed, studying the array of specialized tools and chemical compounds arranged with surgical precision within her leather case. The sophistication of the equipment spoke to years of careful development and refinement. For 3 years, we worked together every evening after the gallery closed. Miss Vale confirmed, her dignity intact despite the circumstances. Cornelius provided the artistic vision and chemical innovations, while I contributed the mechanical systems necessary to create controlled environments within the canvas structure itself. Lady Margaret was our masterpiece, the culmination of everything we had learned about permanent preservation. As Holmes continued his systematic documentation, I found myself reflecting on the intricate tapestry of clues he had unraveled throughout our investigation. The peculiar scent of lavender, which I had initially dismissed as mere perfume, was actually a crucial component of the restoration solvent. The glowing fragments, dismissed by others as simple phosphorescence, were sophisticated indicators of the painting's maintenance requirements. The rhythmic mechanical sounds, the subtle fluctuations in gaslight intensity, the precise timing of the watchman's incapacitation, each element, seemingly disparate, had been methodically woven into a coherent narrative by Holmes's unparalleled deductive reasoning. My own mind, though trained in the precise observation of medical science, had been repeatedly led astray by the theatrical nature of the situation. I had, like Lestrade and Sir Edmund, been caught in the web of misdirection, allowing sensational claims of supernatural phenomena to cloud my analytical judgment. Holmes, however, had remained impervious to such distractions, his logical faculties cutting through the elaborate illusion with surgical precision. When Lestrade formally placed Miss Vale under arrest, she offered no resistance, merely requesting a moment to gather her personal effects. Her composure, even in that moment of profound personal crisis, was remarkable. As the constables prepared to escort her away, she cast one final glance at Lady Margaret's serene countenance, and I detected the faintest suggestion of a smile touching her lips, the expression of someone who, despite facing serious legal consequences, knew she had achieved her ultimate objective. The greatest irony, Holmes mused as we prepared to depart the now quiet gallery, is that Miss Vale's deception, while legally questionable, has accomplished something genuinely remarkable. Blackwood's revolutionary techniques are now receiving the serious scholarly attention they always deserved. The hoax may be exposed, but the underlying scientific innovations remain. Extraordinary achievements worthy of preservation and study. The case of Lady Margaret's supernatural resilience was approaching its resolution, yet I sensed that Holmes had not yet revealed all the threads he had unraveled in this most complex and fascinating mystery. The morning light filtering through the Whitmore Gallery's windows seemed to strip away the last vestiges of supernatural mystery, leaving only the cold reality of exposed deception. Lestrade efficiently directed his constables in collecting Miss Vale's sophisticated equipment, each piece of apparatus now revealed as the instrument of an elaborate scientific fraud rather than miraculous preservation. Sir Edmund stood in contemplative silence, his distinguished features reflecting the complex emotions of a man who had witnessed both betrayal and extraordinary technical achievement within his own establishment. As we prepared for departure, Holmes conducted one final examination of the portrait hall, his magnifying glass revealing details that had escaped previous scrutiny. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, indicating a barely perceptible groove running along the skirting board, partially concealed beneath an ornate Persian rug. This conducts into a service cavity behind the wall, a Georgian builder's convenience for distributing warm air, which Miss Vale adapted for her purposes. Following his indication, I could discern the subtle modification that had allowed the portrait's internal mechanism to operate independently of human intervention. The engineering was remarkable in its ingenuity, representing a fusion of artistic vision and mechanical precision that transcended conventional conservation methods. Our hansom cab journey to Baker Street proceeded in that contemplative silence which typically followed the resolution of Holmes's most complex cases. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing a London slowly awakening to another day. Yet my mind remained occupied with the extraordinary events we had witnessed. I found myself marveling once again at Holmes's unerring ability to discern rational explanations beneath seemingly supernatural phenomena. His systematic approach, cutting through layers of carefully constructed illusion with surgical precision. "It is remarkable, Holmes," I observed as our cab turned into familiar streets, "how readily the human mind embraces the extraordinary over the merely complex." Miss Vale understood this fundamental aspect of human psychology and exploited it with considerable sophistication. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his grey eyes holding that mixture of satisfaction and philosophical reflection I had learned to associate with successful conclusions. "Indeed, Watson, the desire for mystery often blinds us to the greater wonder of scientific achievement. Miss Vale's mechanical artistry was far more impressive than any supernatural phenomenon could have been." Upon reaching Baker Street, we had scarcely settled into our familiar sitting room when Mrs. Hudson announced an unexpected visitor. Sir Edmund Whitmore entered with obvious urgency, his usual composed demeanor replaced by an expression of earnest determination. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble, I have come to make an unusual request regarding Miss Vale's situation. While I cannot condone her deceptive methods, I recognize that her actions sprang from loyalty to artistic achievement rather than personal gain. I am prepared to recommend clemency, particularly regarding the charges beyond those essential matters concerning Mr. Grimsby's welfare. Holmes regarded him with evident approval. Your generosity does you credit, Sir Edmund. Such consideration will carry significant weight with the magistrate, especially when accompanied by testimony regarding the controlled nature of Miss Vale's experiments and their ultimate service to artistic preservation. Furthermore, Sir Edmund continued, I should prefer to transform this spectacle into legitimate scholarly inquiry. The public's fascination with supernatural phenomena serves no constructive purpose, but Blackwood's innovative techniques deserve serious academic study. An admirable resolution, Holmes replied, already moving toward his desk. I shall immediately contact Professor Hartwell at King's College and the Royal Academy. The mechanism will be properly documented, Blackwood's methods analyzed, and his contributions to artistic conservation formally recognized. Science will triumph over sensationalism. After Sir Edmund's departure, Holmes settled into his customary chair, his pipe emerging as he contemplated the case's broader implications. There is a profound irony in this affair, Watson, he mused, watching smoke rings rise toward our ceiling. Miss Vale's deception, while legally questionable, has achieved something genuinely valuable. Blackwood's revolutionary techniques will now receive the scholarly attention they always deserved. I observed my friend with familiar admiration, recognizing once again his extraordinary ability to illuminate the hidden complexities of human nature. Of deception and misdirection we had encountered, Holmes had approached every element with unwavering commitment to logic and systematic analysis. He had transformed apparent miracle into comprehensible science, revealing the greater wonder that lay beneath superficial mystery. The pursuit of permanence through falsehood, Holmes continued philosophically, ultimately defeats itself. Truth may be slower to emerge than fiction, but it possesses a resilience that no deception can match. Before I could respond to this observation, Mrs. Hudson's gentle knock announced the morning post. Holmes glanced at the topmost envelope and smiled with renewed interest. Ah, Watson, he said, rising with characteristic energy. Colonel Armitage writes concerning a most peculiar telegram that apparently arrived before it was dispatched. It seems London's capacity for producing enigmas remains inexhaustible. I reached for my coat with familiar anticipation, knowing that while one mystery had reached its satisfying conclusion, another adventure was already beckoning from the endless complexity of human affairs. The afternoon light filtering through our Baker Street windows cast long shadows across Holmes's carefully arranged evidence as he prepared to illuminate the final threads of our most perplexing case. Lestrade sat forward in his chair with obvious anticipation, while I readied my notebook to capture what I knew would be another masterful demonstration of logical deduction. The foundation of this mystery, Holmes began, his grey eyes bright with intellectual satisfaction, was established the moment you mentioned repeated restoration without evidence of intrusion. To accept such phenomena, one must choose between invisible hands or mechanisms that render ordinary hands unnecessary. I invariably prefer mechanisms to spectres. Holmes rose and moved to his evidence table, where fragments and vials were arranged with scientific precision. Consider the sensory evidence systematically. The persistent lavender scent reported by Grimsby, Watson, and myself was not mere perfume, but lavender spike oil, a sophisticated solvent used in specialized varnish preparations. These phosphorescent particles you discovered were not occult byproducts. but engineered indicators containing rare Earth compounds that announce when surface films require mobilization. The reframing provided crucial opportunity, he continued, examining a minute sample under his magnifying glass. When I studied the frame's interior, microscopic abrasions revealed the passage of thin tubing. The skirting board's concealed groove communicated with Georgian-era air channels, providing our bellows system with its respiratory mechanism. The stethoscope confirmed a regulated mechanical heartbeat. No ghost ever maintained such precise timing. Holmes turned his attention to a detailed floor plan he had sketched. The human element demanded equal scrutiny. Sir Edmund's genuine ignorance was evident, Pierce's explanations plausible, though convenient. Miss Vale, however, possessed not merely access and knowledge, but distinctive physical evidence. Her expensive boots left characteristic wear patterns, inward pressure at the heel, which I found repeatedly in the marble scuffs near the portrait and confirmed in my ash crescents during our nocturnal observation. 2000. The watchman's testimony required particular analysis. Holmes observed, producing the patrol ledger. Grimsby heard a cultured voice. Miss Vale's educated tones are unmistakable. He succumbed to chloral hydrate, yet no vial appeared. The delivery mechanism was ingenious. Pierce's midnight tea service, with the drug dissolved into the common sugar bowl. A few treated grains ensured Grimsby's incapacitation would coincide precisely with the restoration performance. Lestrade nodded with growing comprehension. And the handwriting evidence? Observe these samples, Holmes replied, displaying the post, anonymous note, and ledger entry. Both exhibit the characteristics of someone accustomed to steel nibs, attempting to use pencil firm downstrokes with uncertain returns. The paper bore Whitmore Gallery watermarks, accessible only to staff members. Most tellingly, the graphite retained traces of lavender oil, indicating Miss Vale had handled solvents immediately before writing. 3 weeks later, the case reached its formal conclusion in Magistrate Thornfield's chambers, where Holmes's meticulous documentation, combined with Sir Edmund's passionate testimony regarding Miss Vale's exemplary service and the controlled nature of her experiments. The magistrate, recognizing the absence of malicious intent and the careful dosage calculations that had prevented lasting harm to Grimsby, imposed a remarkably lenient sentence. Miss Vale received 6 months' imprisonment for administering chloral hydrate without consent, though the fraud and public mischief charges were suspended in recognition of her ultimate service to artistic preservation. More significantly, the Royal Academy commissioned her to compile a comprehensive study of Blackwood's revolutionary techniques, ensuring that legitimate scientific inquiry would emerge from the elaborate deception. The portrait itself became the centerpiece of a remarkable exhibition titled Innovation in Artistic Preservation, where Professor Hartwell's analysis revealed the true extent of Blackwood's genius. The mechanical apparatus, once exposed to proper scientific scrutiny, proved to represent advances in conservation methodology decades ahead of contemporary practice. Art historians from across Europe arrived to study the fusion of chemistry and engineering that had made Lady Margaret's apparent immortality possible. Elias Thorne returned from Paris with contracts from major European collectors, his devotion to Blackwood's memory vindicated in ways that surpassed even Miss Vale's ambitious deceptions. The young man's gratitude was evident when he approached us at the exhibition's opening. "Mr. Holmes," he said earnestly, "Miss Vale's methods may have been questionable, but her results have been extraordinary. Cornelius's techniques are now being studied at the Sorbonne, the Royal Academy, and the Vienna Institute. His dream of permanent artistic preservation is finally receiving serious scholarly attention." As December evening deepened around our familiar sitting room, Holmes settled into his chair with that expression of philosophical contentment that typically followed successful resolutions. The morning papers carried detailed accounts of the exhibition, emphasizing the scientific innovations rather than supernatural sensations. "It is a peculiar thing, Watson," he mused, watching smoke from his pipe curl toward the ceiling. "How often the pursuit of truth leads one through the labyrinth of human folly. Miss Vale's grand deception, though misguided in execution, was born of genuine desire to elevate what she perceived as neglected genius. One cannot but admire the ingenuity even while deploring the methods. I reflected on the case, my admiration for Holmes deepening with each demonstration of his unique insight. Your ability to strip away the sensational and expose the underlying mechanism is truly remarkable, Holmes. The public sought a miracle, but you offered them something far more profound, the disciplined application of scientific principles. The mechanism was merely the visible manifestation of deeper human drama, Holmes replied, waving a dismissive hand. A man's life work, a woman's devotion, a public's credulity, these are the true components of any interesting case. The phosphorescent pigments and clockwork bellows were merely stage props. The greatest challenge is not solving the puzzle, but understanding the mind that created it. His gaze drifted to Colonel Armitage's letter, still resting on the mantelpiece, a telegram that arrived before it was dispatched. He murmured, a faint smile playing on his lips. A temporal paradox, perhaps, or merely another instance of human fallibility disguised as the impossible. I knew then that our brief respite was ending. Holmes's mind, ever hungry for intellectual stimulation, had already moved beyond Lady Margaret's enduring smile to the next enigma awaiting methodical dissection. The December fog clinging to London's streets seemed to hold not merely winter's chill, but the promise of countless untold stories, each waiting for the keen eye and relentless logic of Sherlock Holmes to bring their hidden truths to light. Lady Margaret continued to hang in the Whitmore Gallery, her enigmatic smile now accompanied by detailed explanations of the remarkable preservation techniques that had made her brief supernatural career possible. The portrait that would not fade had become a testament to human ingenuity rather than otherworldly intervention. A far more remarkable achievement than any ghostly phenomenon could have provided.